In the shadowed cradle of eternity, where blood whispers secrets to the wind, a single drop can bind souls across the veil of death. The rain fell like forgotten tears upon the crumbling spires of Eldridge Castle, a relic of forgotten kings where the air hung heavy with the scent of damp stone and wilted roses. Elias Thorne, once a scholar of ancient tomes and fleeting mortal pursuits, now lay broken in the dim chamber, his body a map of betrayals. At 32, he had journeyed from the bustling streets of Victorian London, where he had been a promising archaeologist unearthing relics of empires long dust, only to find himself abandoned by ambition and fever. A curse from a rival expedition in the Carpathian wilds had seeped into his veins, a wasting sickness that turned his nights to fire and his days to ash. Disillusioned, he had sought solace in these forsaken halls, drawn by whispers of a hidden library said to hold cures for the incurable. But solitude had only deepened his despair, leaving him hollow, his once sharp mind dulled by pain, his heart armored against the world's cruelties. He coughed, the sound ragged against the thunder outside, his fingers clutching the edge of a threadbare velvet curtain. The room flickered with the unsteady glow of a single candelabrum, its flames dancing like hesitant spirits on the walls, etched with faded frescoes of winged guardians and shadowed thrones. Elias's reflection in the cracked mirror across the room stared back accusingly, a gaunt face framed by disheveled dark hair, eyes sunken like wells of unspoken regret. He had desired knowledge above all, yet it had led him here, to this precipice where death lingered, invisible and patient, its breath cool against his fevered skin. Footsteps echoed from the corridor, soft yet deliberate, like the patter of rain on ancient wood. The door creaked open, admitting a figure cloaked in midnight silk, her presence shifting the air as if the shadows themselves bowed. Lyrian, the Dhampir of the veiled court, moved with the grace of one who straddled worlds, neither fully mortal nor eternally damned. Born of a forbidden union in the mist-shrouded valleys of Transylvania 2 centuries past, she was the daughter of a noble vampire lord and a human seer who had bartered her life for a glimpse of the stars. Lyrian's immortality was a fractured gift. She aged as mortals did in her youth, but slowly, her blood a potent elixir tainted by the hunger she could never fully sate. Marked by guilt from the night she slew her mother's assassins, only to watch her fade in her arms, Lyrian wandered solitarily, an ethical wanderer in a realm of predators. She sought redemption not in conquest, but in quiet acts of mercy, her desires woven with the thorns of isolation, yearning for a connection that wouldn't shatter under the weight of her duality. Her eyes, a stormy gray flecked with silver, met Elias's as she approached, the hem of her gown trailing like spilled ink. "You seek the library's secrets," she said, her voice a low melody laced with the accent of forgotten tongues, resonant yet weary. "But the castle guards more than books. It guards the forgotten." Elias pushed himself upright, wincing as pain lanced through his chest. "I've come for a cure, not riddles. The fever. It devours me." His words were defiant, but beneath them lay the raw edge of desperation, a man who had lost faith in miracles, yet clung to the frayed threads of hope. Lyrian knelt beside his makeshift bed of furs and faded tapestries, her hand hovering near his brow without touching. The air between them hummed with unspoken tension, the scent of her, jasmine and iron, mingling with the metallic tang of his illness. She was no stranger to suffering. Her own veins carried the echo of her father's eternal night, a solitude that had taught her the fragility of mortal flames. "Cures come at a price," she murmured, her gaze tracing the veins pulsing faintly at his throat. "The king of these shadows, my sire, rules with an iron ethic. He spares the innocent, but eternity is no gift for the broken-hearted." Elias's laugh was bitter, echoing hollowly. "I'm already broken. What more can shadows take?" Yet as her proximity stirred something deep within him, a warmth against the chill of abandonment, He felt the first crack in his rational armor. Love, he told himself, was a fool's delusion, especially for one teetering on oblivion, but her presence resisted that logic, inevitable as the tide. Outside, the storm raged, lightning fracturing the sky like veins of divine wrath. Lyrian's fingers brushed his wrist, cool and steady, assessing the fever's grip. In that touch, a philosophical undercurrent stirred. Was salvation found in yielding to the unknown, or in defiant isolation? She had resisted such bonds before, rationalizing her loneliness as penance, but Elias's quiet strength, forged in disillusion, pulled at the shadows of her guilt. As the night deepened, she made her choice. From a hidden vial at her throat, she drew a slender silver dagger, its blade catching the candlelight in a gleam of forbidden promise. "Drink," she whispered, pricking her palm. Crimson welled, rich and vital, carrying the essence of her Dhampir blood, half life, half eternity. Elias recoiled. The moral dilemma etching his features. To accept was to invite transformation, to blur the line between man and myth. Death hovered closer, its invisible form a silent witness, urging surrender. But the pain crested, a wave of fire that blurred his vision. With trembling lips, he drank, the blood warm and electric on his tongue, tasting of roses crushed under moonlight. It coursed through him like liquid starlight, mending fractures he hadn't known existed. Strength returned in surges, his breaths evening, the fever receding like mist before dawn. Yet as vitality bloomed, a mark seared into his skin. A faint, silvery sigil on his collarbone, her essence etched eternally. Lyrian watched, her expression a tapestry of relief and dread. "You've taken my mark," she said softly, the words heavy with implication. "It binds you to me, and to the kingdom beyond these walls." Elias touched the warm brand, realization dawning like a curse unveiled. In healing him, she had awakened something ancient within, a pull toward her shadowed world, where love promised redemption, but threatened to eclipse his mortality. The castle's secrets now whispered his name, and in the distance, the low toll of a hidden bell signaled the approach of dawn, or something far more perilous. The first light of dawn crept through the fractured panes like a thief, pale and insidious, casting elongated shadows across the chamber where Elias lay transformed. The mark on his collarbone pulsed faintly, a silver-threaded scar that hummed with Lyrian's essence, as if her blood had woven itself into the very rhythm of his heart. He rose unsteadily from the furs, the fever's grip shattered, leaving behind a clarity that bordered on revelation. His body felt renewed, muscles coiling with an unfamiliar vitality, yet the air tasted of iron and regret. Outside, the storm had ebbed to a mournful drizzle, pattering against the stone, like the fading echoes of his mortality. Lyrian stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the gray veil of morning, arms crossed as if to ward off the light she both craved and feared. 2 centuries of fractured existence had etched lines of quiet sorrow into her features. High cheekbones shadowed by the weight of choices unmade, lips pressed thin against the hunger that gnawed eternally at her core. She had shared her blood not out of impulse, but a deliberate act of mercy, born from the guilt that shadowed her like a second skin. The assassin's blades in her mother's final night had taught her the cost of hesitation. Now, in saving Elias, she wondered if she had merely postponed a deeper wound. Her desires, once confined to the solace of solitary wanderings through mist-choked forests, now tangled with the risk of attachment, a bond that could redeem or unravel her. "You feel it, don't you?" she said, turning to him, her voice a silken thread pulled taut. The gray of her eyes caught the dawn's gleam, flecked with silver like stars drowning in twilight. "The mark isn't just a scar, it's a tether. My Father's kingdom will sense it now, drawn to the echo of my blood in your veins." Elias flexed his fingers, marveling at the absence of pain, the way his skin tingled as if brushed by unseen winds. At 32, he had chased shadows across continents, unearthing buried truths, only to bury his own hopes beneath layers of disillusion. The Carpathian curse had been his undoing, a rival's venomous relic that twisted his scholarly pursuit into a death sentence. Abandoned by colleagues who whispered of his madness, he had retreated to Eldridge Castle, seeking not just a cure but oblivion from a world that had forsaken him. Yet this was no mere remedy. The blood's warmth lingered in his chest, stirring philosophical tempests. Had he chosen life, or merely traded one cage for another? "What kingdom?" he asked, his tone edged with the defiance of a man who had rationalized away miracles. "You speak of shadows and sires as if they're real." "I drank to survive, not to join some eternal masquerade." She approached, the hem of her silk gown whispering over the worn oak floorboards, each step releasing the faint scent of jasmine mingled with the earthy bite of rain-soaked earth. The room's textures enveloped them, the velvet curtains heavy with damp, the candelabram's wax pooled like frozen tears, the mirror's cracked surface reflecting their forms in fractured intimacy. Lyrian's hand grazed his arm, cool as marble yet alive with restrained power. "The Vale Court," she murmured, her breath stirring the fine hairs at his nape. "My father, King Vesperian, rules from the obsidian spires beyond these ruins. He is no monster of legend, ethical, solitary, burdened by centuries of guilt for the wars he waged to protect our kind. He chose eternity not for power, but to safeguard the fragile line between worlds. Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die. Elias. But that choice demands tribute." He pulled away, the contact igniting a spark that resisted his logic, a pull toward her that felt both inevitable and profane. Love, he reminded himself, was a delusion for the hale, not the half-healed. Yet the mark warmed under his touch, a symbolic anchor, like a rose etched in silver, blooming where death had nearly taken root. The air thickened with the distant rumble of thunder, or perhaps the low growl of something awakening in the castle's depths. "And what tribute do they demand of me?" His voice cracked, betraying the moral chasm yawning before him. To embrace this was to forsake the human frailty he had clung to, the disillusion that had armored his heart. Transformation whispered of redemption. But at what cost to his soul? Lyrian's gaze softened, a flicker of her own resistance surfacing, the way she had rationalized solitude as her penance, denying the yearning for a companion who saw beyond her duality. "The mark announces you as mine," she confessed, the words laced with dread. "It heals, but it binds. The court will come for you, to judge if you're worthy of the shadow's grace. Vesperian spares the innocent, but betrayal lurks in every alliance. Wars have been fought over lesser ties, political machinations where Dhampirs like me are pawns in eternal games of power and betrayal." As she spoke, a chill seeped through the walls, the drizzle outside intensifying into a relentless sheet that blurred the world beyond. Elias paced, his bare feet silent on the cold stone, each step a dialogue with the invisible specter of death that had retreated but not vanished. It lingered in the corners, a patient observer, reminding him of the choices yet to come, mortality's fleeting light or eternity's shadowed embrace. The philosophical undercurrent swelled. Could love redeem without cursing, or was suffering the true path to transcendence? Suddenly, the door shuddered under a heavy knock, the wood groaning like a beast roused from slumber. Lyrian tensed, her hand drifting to the dagger at her belt, its silver hilt glinting ominously. "They've come sooner than I feared," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his with the intensity that stripped away pretenses. Voices murmured beyond, low and resonant, carrying the timbre of ancient authority, emissaries from the Vale Court, drawn by the mark's call. Elias's heart thundered, the vitality in his veins now a double-edged blade. In that moment, the choice crystallized. Flee into the dawn's fragile mercy or step into the shadows with her, where love promised both salvation and subjugation. The door began to splinter under insistent pressure, and as the first sliver of darkness seeped through the crack, he realized the true peril was not the kingdom awaiting, but the part of himself already awakening to her inevitable pull. The door splintered inward with a resonant crack, like the fracture of old bone under relentless pressure, admitting a gust of chill wind laced with the metallic tang of distant forges and pine-swept crags. 3 figures emerged from the corridor's gloom, their forms cloaked in hooded mantles of deepest indigo, embroidered with silver threads that caught the dawn's feeble light like veins of frost. They moved as one, shadows given purpose, their boots echoing softly on the oak floorboards, each step a measured claim upon the space. At their forefront stood a tall man, his face angular and pale as polished alabaster, eyes like polished obsidian reflecting no warmth. Beside him, a woman with raven hair coiled like serpents, and a younger sentinel whose gaze darted with the wariness of one who had seen too many betrayals in the court's endless intrigues. Lyrian positioned herself between Elias and the intruders, her posture a blend of defiance and weary resignation, the dagger now drawn and gleaming in her grip. The air thickened with the scent of wet earth and smoldering embers, the drizzle outside drumming a frantic rhythm against the panes, as if the sky itself mourned the intrusion. Her heart, that half-mortal pulse she could never fully silence, quickened, not from fear, but from the gnawing certainty that her act of mercy had ignited a chain of consequences she could no longer contain. 2 centuries of ethical solitude had honed her into a guardian of fragile boundaries, yet guilt clawed at her anew. By sharing her blood, had she not just painted a target on Elias's renewed flesh? "The mark calls to us," the lead emissary intoned. His voice a low rumble like thunder trapped in cavernous halls, carrying the weight of ancient oaths. He was Thorn, a Dhampir enforcer of the Vale Court, scarred by the political wars that had ravaged the kingdom a century past, betrayals where alliances shattered like glass under the weight of ambition. King Vesperian's edicts demanded loyalty, but whispers of rebellion stirred in the obsidian spires, factions vying for power in the shadows of eternity. "Lyrian, daughter of the crown, you have bound a mortal to our bloodline without sanction." The king senses the ripple. He bids you bring the marked one before the throne to weigh his worth against the Vale's fragile peace. Elias stood frozen, the vitality surging through him now, a turbulent river, clashing against the rational barriers he had so carefully erected. The mark on his collarbone burned faintly, a silver rose blooming in intricate filigree beneath his shirt, its petals unfurling with each beat of his heart, a symbol of the tether that pulled him inexorably toward this unseen realm. At 32, his life had been a tapestry of scholarly pursuits undone by disillusion, the Carpathian expedition where envy had poisoned his blood, leaving him abandoned in a world that prized discovery over the discoverer. He had rationalized survival as mere endurance, but this was transformation's cruel jest. Love for Lyrian flickered at the edges of his denial, resisted as a siren's call amid the storm, yet inevitable as the dawn that now painted the room in hues of reluctant gold. Death, that invisible companion, hovered in the emissary's unyielding stares, a reminder that every choice skirted its embrace. "I saved him," Lyrian replied, her tone steady but laced with the undercurrent of philosophical defiance, her gray eyes flashing silver in the candlelight's dying flicker. She sheathed the dagger, a gesture of calculated trust, though her fingers trembled with the texture of restrained power, the cool silk of her gown against her skin, the distant patter of rain like tears unshed. The fever would have claimed him, as it claims so many innocents in these forsaken places. "My blood is mercy, not rebellion," Elias seeks no throne, he seeks only to live. Thorn's gaze shifted to Elias, appraising as if peeling back layers of flesh to the soul beneath. The woman's hand rested on a hilted sword at her belt, its pommel etched with the court's sigil. A crescent moon cradling a thorned rose, emblem of beauty wrought in suffering. Mercy has its rituals, Thorn said, stepping closer, the air around him humming with restrained menace. The marked must swear fealty or face the unbinding, a rite that severs the blood's gift, returning what was taken. But in these times of war, such bonds stir the old fractures. The eastern clans plot against Vesperian, whispering of a Dhampir who defies the king's ethics for a mortal's whim. Betrayal festers like rot in the roots. Elias's mind reeled, the room's textures assaulting him anew. The velvet curtains brushing his arm like ghostly fingers, the mirror's cracks splintering his reflection into a mosaic of doubt. Introspection flooded him. Was this redemption, a path from his broken isolation to something transcendent, or a curse that would eclipse his humanity? He had desired knowledge, not eternity, yet Lyrian's proximity, her scent of jasmine and iron weaving through the damp air, unraveled his resistance. The love they skirted was no youthful fancy, but a profound ache, coexisting with the pain of what it demanded, surrender to the shadows where light and darkness danced in eternal tension. Lyrian turned to him then, her hand finding his in a touch that bridged worlds, cool against his warming skin. "The ritual awaits in the court's heart," she whispered, urgency threading her words like silver veins. "Refuse, and the mark fades, but so does the life I gave you. Accept, and you walk with me into the veil, where love might redeem us both, or doom us to the king's judgment." Her eyes held his, stormy depths reflecting his own turmoil. The guilt of her past mingling with a desire she had long rationalized away. In that gaze, the philosophical core crystallized. Eternity was no escape from suffering, but a mirror to its beauty, where memory and choice forged the soul anew. The choice loomed, a ritual unspoken yet palpable, the emissary's patience thinning as the drizzle swelled to a roar, wind howling through the breached door like the kingdom's impatient breath. Elias felt the mark pulse, the silver rose igniting with ethereal light, illuminating the path forward. To swear fealty was to embrace the inevitable pull toward Lyrian, to let love's redemption eclipse his mortal disillusion, or to sever it, courting death's return in the fragile dawn. As Thorn extended a gauntleted hand, bearing a vial of obsidian liquid that swirled like captured night, Elias hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing like an unseen crown. The air crackled with suspended tension, the castle's stones seeming to lean in, expectant. In that suspended breath, a shadow detached from the corridor's depths, a cloaked figure watching, unseen, whose presence whispered of deeper betrayals yet to unfold. Elias's lips parted to speak, but the words caught, leaving him on the precipice, the bond's curse and salvation hanging by a thread as fragile as his reclaimed life. The vial of obsidian liquid trembled in Thorn's gauntleted hand, its surface swirling like the abyss captured in glass, reflecting the fractured dawn in eddies of captured night. Elias's breath caught, the air in the chamber growing thick with the scent of ozone and damp wool from the emissaries' cloaks, as if the storm outside had seeped into their very weave. The silver rose on his collarbone throbbed in rhythm with his pulse, a living emblem of the bond he could neither fully embrace nor reject, its petals seeming to unfurl beneath his skin like a secret blooming in the dark. He stood there, renewed yet unmoored, his once fevered body now humming with an alien vigor that made every texture vivid, the rough grain of the oak floorboards underfoot, the velvet curtain's heavy brush against his shoulder, the cool draft whispering through the splintered door like death's deferred sigh. Lyrian's fingers tightened around his, her touch a anchor in the swelling tide of uncertainty, her skin pale as moonlight against his warming flesh. She had resisted this pull from the moment their paths crossed in the castle's shadowed halls, rationalizing it as folly, a Dhampir's fleeting mercy for a mortal's plight, nothing more. Yet the mark she had bestowed bound them in ways her solitary centuries had never prepared her for. Guilt from her mother's fading breaths now mingled with a deeper ache, the desire for redemption through connection that eternity's isolation had starved. "Choose," she urged softly, her voice a silken thread amid the emissary's expectant silence, gray eyes pleading yet resolute. "The unbinding would unravel what I've given, but it spares you the court's gaze. Or step with me into the veil, where our fates entwine beyond these ruins." The woman's raven hair caught the candle's dying flicker as she shifted, her sword's hilt glinting with the court's thorned crescent, a symbol of alliances forged in blood and betrayal. "Delay invites suspicion," she warned, her tone laced with the weariness of one who had navigated the kingdom's political tempests. Factions clashing in obsidian halls over Vesperian's ethical reign, where mercy was weaponized against the king's unyielding code. The younger sentinel's eyes, sharp and shadowed, darted to the corridor, as if sensing the unseen watcher whose presence lingered like a chill fog at the edges of perception. Elias's mind churned, philosophical tempests raging beneath his scholar's facade. He had chased forgotten empires across dusty tomes and forsaken digs, only to unearth his own disillusion in the Carpathian's venomous embrace. Abandoned by those who once hailed his intellect, he had armored his heart against vulnerability, deeming love a luxury for the unbroken. Yet Lyrian's proximity unraveled that armor, her jasmine and iron scent weaving through the room's damp musk, stirring an inevitable warmth that coexisted with the fear of transformation's curse. Death, ever the invisible sentinel, pressed close now, not as fever's blaze, but as the quiet void of severance, its breath cool on the mark's heated bloom. To accept the vial was to court oblivion's return. To refuse was to yield to the shadows, where redemption might flower amid suffering's thorns. "I'll go," Elias said at last, the words tasting of ash and resolve, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. The emissaries nodded as one, Thorn corking the vial with a click that echoed like a sealed fate. Lyrian's relief washed over her features, softening the lines etched by 200 years of ethical wanderings, though dread shadowed her eyes. The knowledge that presenting him to Vesperian risked exposing fractures in the court's fragile peace, where her blood's echo could ignite old wars. They departed the chamber under the drizzle's relentless veil, the castle's corridors unfolding like veins of ancient stone, lit by sporadic torches that sputtered in iron sconces, casting elongated shadows that danced like hesitant specters. The air grew colder, heavier with the tang of moss and subterranean earth, as they descended winding stairs into the undercroft where a concealed archway yawned, its keystone carved with the silver rose, Lyrian's sigil, now his. Thorn pressed a rune-etched palm to the stone, and the arch shimmered, parting to reveal a mist-choked threshold. The veil between worlds, a swirling nexus of fog and faint luminescence, humming with the low thrum of distant heartbeats. Stepping through felt like plunging into a dream's embrace, the mist cool and cloying against Elias's skin, tasting of salt and forgotten rain. The veil court materialized in fragments, obsidian spires piercing a perpetual twilight sky, where bioluminescent vines clung to jagged walls, glowing with an inner crimson pulse like veins exposed to the night. The ground beneath was polished black marble veined with silver, cool and unyielding, reflecting the party's forms in distorted mirrors of eternity. Distant echoes carried the murmur of voices in archaic tongues, the clash of steel from training grounds where Dhampirs honed skills against encroaching mortal wars, and the faint, mournful toll of bells marking the endless cycle of memory and loss. Lyrian guided him through winding paths lined with arched galleries, where tapestries depicted battles long past, Vesperian's legions clashing with rebel clans, thorns of betrayal piercing crowns of shadow. Her hand never left his, a tether amid the court's sensory assault. The velvet hush of wind through vine-wrapped colonnades, the metallic whisper of guards' armor, the subtle glow of candelabras holding flames that burned without heat, eternal as the king's guilt-ridden rule. She had been born here, in these mists, to a father who chose immortality, not for conquest, but to shield his fractured kin from humanity's encroaching light. Vesperian, solitary and marked by the wars that claimed his mortal love centuries ago, enforced ethics that spared the innocent yet demanded unyielding loyalty, a code Lyrian had internalized, her own traumas weaving her desires into quiet acts of defiance. They entered the throne hall, a vast cavern of vaulted ceilings lost in gloom, illuminated by a central chandelier of crystal thorns dripping with frozen dew, its light fracturing into rainbows of blood-red and gold. At the far end, upon a dais of ebony and ivory, sat King Vesperian, tall and regal, his form clad in robes of midnight velvet embroidered with silver filigree, eyes like storm-tossed seas holding the weight of millennia. His face, ageless yet lined with sorrow, bore the scars of choices unhealed, a faint cicatrice across his cheek from the night he spared a traitor's child, only to watch it fuel a rebellion. He rose as they approached, the air humming with restrained power, the scent of aged wine and incense thickening the space. "Daughter," Vesperian intoned, his voice resonant as thunder in velvet hollows, carrying the timbre of one who had witnessed every immortal's origin, each a soul that chose not to die, burdened by the beauty of their suffering. "You bring a marked mortal to my court, unbidden. The blood's echo disturbs the veil, stirring whispers of discord among the clans. Explain this mercy before judgment falls." Lyrian stepped forward, releasing Elias's hand with evident reluctance, her posture straight yet laced with the texture of vulnerability, the silk of her gown shifting like whispered confessions. "Father, he was dying, forsaken in Eldridge's ruins. My blood healed him, as it has healed others in shadows. He bears the rose not as a conqueror, but as one seeking light amid despair. In these times of war, is not redemption the truest fealty?" Elias felt the king's gaze upon him, piercing as a blade, unearthing the layers of his disillusion, the abandoned expeditions, the fever's isolation, the rational barriers crumbling under Lyrian's inevitable draw. The mark burned brighter, the silver rose illuminating his collarbone through his shirt, a beacon of their shared transformation. Love, resisted yet blooming, promised to redeem his brokenness, but the court's shadows loomed with curses unspoken, betrayals that could shatter their fragile bond. Vesperian descended the dais, his presence filling the hall like encroaching night, the chandelier's light dimming in deference. He extended a hand toward Elias, palm upturned, revealing his own mark, a thorned circlet of faded gold. "The ritual of binding demands truth," the king said, his tone a philosophical lament. "Swear your intent, mortal, or let the veil claim what was borrowed. But know this, in choosing eternity's embrace, you invite the wars that rage beyond these spires, factions that see your mark as a spark to ignite the old flames." As Elias opened his mouth to respond, a sudden tremor shook the hall, the marble floor cracking with a sound like shattering glass. Shouts erupted from the galleries, guards drawing blades as shadows coalesced into forms unbidden, the unseen watcher from the castle revealing itself at last. A cloaked rebel, eyes blazing with treason's fire, dagger raised not at the king, but at Lyrian's unguarded back. The air exploded into chaos, the silver rose on Elias's skin, flaring like a warning, forcing him to confront the choice not in words, but in blood-soaked action, as love's redemption teetered on the edge of violent loss. The chaos erupted like a vein bursting in the heart of the throne hall, the marble floor fracturing further under the rebels' advance, sending shards skittering across the polished surface like scattered teeth of some ancient beast. The cloaked figure lunged from the shadows, dagger arcing through the air with lethal precision, its blade catching the chandelier's fractured light in a gleam of cold malice. Lyrian, her back turned in the vulnerability of supplication, twisted at the last instant, instinct honed by centuries of ethical vigilance, but the tip grazed her shoulder, tearing silk and flesh in a spray of crimson that bloomed against the midnight velvet of her gown. The metallic tang of her blood filled the air, mingling with the incense's heavy pall, a sensory assault that rooted Elias in place for a heartbeat too long. His mark ignited then, the silver rose flaring beneath his skin like a forge's sudden blaze, heat surging through his veins as if Lyrian's essence rebelled against the wound. Elias moved without thought, propelled by an inevitable force that shattered his rational hesitations, the scholar's armor of disillusion cracking under the raw imperative of protection. He seized a fallen guard's sword from the marble, its hilt cool and unyielding in his grip, and intercepted the rebel mid-stride. The clash rang out, steel on steel, echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a dirge for fragile peace. The rebel's hood fell back, revealing a face twisted by fanatic zeal, scarred and hollow-cheeked, eyes burning with the fervor of Eastern clans who decried Vespasian's mercy as weakness, plotting to overthrow the king through betrayals sown in the court's underbelly. Vespasian rose from the dais in a fluid motion, his robes swirling like captured night, commanding the guards with a raised hand that silenced the hall's clamor. "Hold!" he thundered, his voice a resonant wave that quelled the drawn blades, though tension hummed in the air like a bowstring drawn taut. The rebel staggered back from Elias's parry, surprise flickering in his gaze at the mortal's unexpected ferocity. But Thorn and the raven-haired sentinel closed in, disarming him with efficient brutality. Chains of silver-linked obsidian clinked as they bound the intruder, his curses dissolving into mutters of "the veil fractures. The Dhampir's blood invites the end." Lyrian pressed a hand to her shoulder, blood seeping between her fingers, warm and viscous, staining the white marble with petals of red that mirrored the silver rose's symbolic bloom. Pain etched her features, but it was the philosophical weight that shadowed her eyes, the knowledge that her mercy had drawn this blade, igniting the very wars Vespasian had fought to contain. 2 centuries of solitude had taught her to rationalize such risks as isolated acts, ethical threads in eternity's vast tapestry. Yet Elias's intervention unraveled that isolation. Love, resisted as a curse upon her fractured existence, now asserted itself inevitable, a redemption coexisting with the suffering it invited. "You fought for me," she whispered as he approached, her voice a silken thread amid the hall's settling hush, gray eyes meeting his with a depth that stripped away pretenses. Elias dropped the sword, his hands trembling not from exertion but from the moral chasm yawning within. He, the abandoned scholar whose Carpathian fever had forged him in disillusion's fire, had chosen action over retreat. At 32, his desires had once been confined to unearthed relics and forgotten lore, armored against the world's cruelties, but the mark's pulse synced with hers now. A tactile reminder of transformation's double edge. Death lingered in the blood pooling at her feet, invisible yet palpable, its cool breath urging him to sever the bond before it consumed them both. Yet the warmth of her proximity, the jasmine undertone piercing the metallic reek, pulled him inexorably closer. "I couldn't watch you fall," he admitted, his tone laced with the tragedy of newfound vulnerability, fingers brushing hers to staunch the flow. The touch ignited sparks along his skin, textures vivid, the cool silk of her gown, the sticky warmth of her wound, the distant patter of rain echoing through the spires like unshed tears. Vespasian descended the dais fully, his presence a gravitational force that drew all eyes. The chandelier's crystal thorns casting elongated shadows across his regal form. Scars from ancient battles traced his hands like faded rivers, reminders of the guilt that solitary immortality had etched into his soul. Wars waged not for glory, but to preserve a realm where immortals remembered their mortal origins, each a soul that chose not to die. He knelt beside Lyrian, his touch gentle as he examined the gash, the air humming with restrained power. "This strike was no accident," he murmured, his storm-sea eyes lifting to Elias, appraising the mark's glow with a mix of sorrow and calculation. "The Eastern factions sense weakness in our ethics. Your bond, daughter, amplifies their whispers, a mortal marked by royal blood, a spark for rebellion. Yet in defending her, you prove more than frailty." The king rose, gesturing to a nearby alcove where bioluminescent vines pulsed with healing light, their crimson glow illuminating ancient runes carved into the walls, symbols of rituals that bridged life and shadow. Lyrian allowed Thorn to guide her there, her steps measured, leaving a faint trail of blood that Elias followed. The marbles chill, seeping through his boots like eternity's unyielding grasp. In the alcove's intimacy, away from the hall's watchful eyes, Vesperian drew a vial from his robes, its contents shimmering like liquid moonlight. "The ritual of affirmation," he explained, his voice a philosophical cadence, resonant with the weight of choices unmade. "To seal the mark without full turning, you must share essence willingly, her blood for your vow, your humanity for our veil's protection. Refuse, and the unbinding claims you both, unraveling the healing in agony's embrace. But accept, and you walk eternity's edge with her, where love redeems amid the thorns of war." Elias's heart thundered, the alcove's textures enveloping him, the vine's silken leaves brushing his arm, cool and alive, the faint drip of Lyrian's blood echoing like a metronome of fate, the king's gaze, unblinking, reflecting his own turmoil in obsidian depths. Introspection flooded him. Redemption through this bond promised to mend his broken isolation, transforming disillusion into transcendent purpose, yet it cursed him with the court's shadows, betrayals that could eclipse their fragile light. Lyrian, her wound now staunched by the vine's glow, reached for him, her hand pale and steady. "It's not eternity's full weight," she said softly, resistance fading from her tone, replaced by the inevitable pull of their shared suffering. "Just enough to bind us against the coming storm. I've rationalized solitude too long. With you, perhaps guilt yields to grace." The moral dilemma crested. A wave of fire and ice. To vow was to embrace love's duality, its redemptive beauty intertwined with the pain of endless vigilance. To refuse invited death's return, severing the silver rose and leaving her to bear the kingdom's fractures alone. Death hovered in the alcove's corners, patient as ever, its invisible form a whisper against the vine's hum. Elias nodded, the choice crystallizing in his chest like a thorn taking root. "I vow," he breathed, extending his wrist as Vesperian pricked it with a thorn from the chandelier's edge, crimson welling to meet Lyrian's offered palm in a ritual mingling, blood to blood, mortality to shadow. The essence fused in the vial, swirling into a radiant silver, sealing with a warmth that spread through them both, mending her wound and etching the rose deeper into his flesh. Strength bloomed anew, but so did clarity. The bond's curse unveiled visions, flashes of the court's intrigues, rebel plots weaving through the spires like venomous roots. Vesperian watched, his expression a tapestry of paternal sorrow and strategic resolve. "You are affirmed," he declared, the words heavy with implication. But the attacker spoke truth, the veil phrase. "Eastern envoys arrive at dusk, demanding tribute for your mark's insult. Choose your words wisely, for in this, love's redemption faces war's unyielding trial." As the king departed, leaving them in the alcove's glowing hush, Lyrian leaned into Elias, her head against his shoulder. the scent of healing vines mingling with her jasmine essence. Exhaustion etched her features, yet a quiet peace flickered there, the first unresisted bloom of their inevitable union. But from the hall's distant echoes rose a new clamor, horns blaring in warning, the tremor returning as if the earth itself rebelled. Shadows coalesced at the threshold, more cloaked figures emerging, not emissaries, but an advance guard of the eastern clans, blades drawn and eyes alight with vengeful fire. Elias tensed, the affirmed mark pulsing like a war drum, forcing them to confront that their private redemption had just ignited the kingdom's powder keg, love's light now a beacon for encroaching darkness. The horn's blare sliced through the alcove's fragile hush like thorns piercing silk, a martial cry that reverberated off the obsidian spires, summoning the court's shadows into frantic motion. Elias pulled Lyrian closer, her body warm against his despite the chill seeping from the marble veins beneath their feet, the silver rose on his collarbone, now a steady thrum, syncing with the distant clash of steel echoing from the throne hall. The bioluminescent vines along the walls pulsed erratically, their crimson glow flickering like heartbeats under duress, casting elongated shadows that twisted across her pale features, high cheekbones flushed from the ritual's afterglow, gray eyes wide with the dawning gravity of their affirmed bond. The scent of healing sap mingled with the acrid bite of impending rain, carried on winds that howled through the galleries, whipping tapestries depicting ancient betrayals into frenzied dances. Vesperian's guards surged past the threshold, their armor clinking like chains of fate, faces etched with the disciplined resolve of those who had chosen eternity to stand against encroaching voids. The king emerged from the hall's depths, his midnight robes billowing as he barked orders in a tongue resonant with archaic power, summoning reinforcements from the mist-choked corridors. Yet beneath his regal command lingered the solitary guilt of centuries, a monarch who had bartered his mortal joys for this vigilant throne, every war a reminder of the immortal's origins, souls that elected shadows over dust. "The eastern vanguard breaches the outer veil," he announced, his storm-sea eyes locking onto Elias and Lyrian with a mixture of paternal urgency and strategic calculation. "They claim your mark as provocation, a Dhampir's folly that mocks our code. Barricade the inner sanctum, we parley at the breach." Lyrian rose unsteadily, her shoulders wound, now a faint scar sealed by the ritual's silver essence. But the pain's echo lingered in her movements, a tactile whisper of vulnerability she had long rationalized away in ethical isolation. 200 years of wandering the fringes of her father's realm had armored her against such chaos, her desires confined to quiet mercies that spared the innocent without entangling her fractured heart. Yet Elias's vow had unraveled that armor, the bond's warmth coexisting with a curse that now drew blades to their door. "This is my doing," she murmured, her voice a low melody laced with philosophical lament, fingers tracing the silver rose mirrored on her own skin, a shared emblem blooming where suffering met redemption. "I resisted the pull, told myself love was a mortal's delusion. But in choosing you, I've invited the kingdom's thorns." Elias's grip tightened on her hand, the affirmed vitality in his veins surging like liquid moonlight, sharpening every sensation. The cool silk of her gown against his palm, the distant roar of the eastern clan's approach, a thunder of boots and war cries filtering through the spires like venom seeping into stone. At 32, his scholarly life had been a chronicle of disillusion, expeditions abandoned in the Carpathians' cursed wilds, colleagues' betrayals leaving him fevered and forsaken, his heart sealed against the world's cruelties. He had desired truths etched in relics, not this transcendent ache, yet the mark's pulse affirmed an inevitable truth. Love was no rational equation, but a force that redeemed through its very torment, transforming isolation into intertwined fates. Death, that unseen companion, pressed closer now, its breath a chill draft amid the gathering storm, urging him to question if this choice exalted life or merely prolonged its shadows. They followed Vesperian through the winding galleries, the court's textures assaulting them anew, the velvet hush of vine-wrapped arches giving way to the metallic tang of drawn steel, torches sputtering in iron sconces as guards rushed to fortified positions. Echoes of the outer breach carried inward, the sizzle of magical wards fracturing under siege spells, the guttural shouts of rebel Dhampirs decrying the king's mercy as surrender to mortal weakness. Political fractures, long simmering in the obsidian underbelly, now erupted, factions led by exiled lords who viewed Lyrian's bloodsharing as the spark to overthrow Vesperian's ethical reign, igniting wars that blurred the veil between worlds. The inner sanctum loomed ahead, a circular chamber ringed by towering windows of stained obsidian that depicted the silver rose in eternal bloom, its petals veined with scenes of redemption amid ruin. Candelabras of crystal thorns held flames that burned with unyielding blue fire, illuminating a central altar of polished ivory and ebony, where runes glowed faintly from the ritual's residue. Vesperian halted at the threshold, turning to them with a gaze heavy as eternity's crown. "The revelation comes here," he said, his tone a somber cadence, resonant with the weight of choices that had forged his solitary path. "To parley without bloodshed, you must invoke the right of thorns, a binding oath where the marked offers essence to the challengers, proving the bond's purity against their accusations. It demands truth. Your love as shield, not sword. Fail, and the clans raise these halls, succeed, and redemption mends the veil's fray." Lyrian's breath hitched, the air thick with the scent of ozone from the ward's strain, rain now lashing the windows in sheets that blurred the encroaching twilight. She had evaded such rituals in her wanderings, rationalizing detachment as her penance for her mother's assassins, but Elias's presence made resistance futile. "The thorns will draw our blood," she explained softly, her free hand hovering over the altar where silver vines stirred like awakening serpents. Mingled and offered, it reveals intent, redemption, or deceit. I've seen it heal alliances, but curse the false-hearted with agony's bloom. Elias nodded, the moral dilemma cresting like a wave. To invoke the right was to embrace the bond's duality, love's redemptive light piercing war's encroaching dark, yet risking a curse that could eclipse their fragile humanity. Introspection swirled, his broken past, the fever's isolation, now transmuted into purpose through her inevitable draw. Death lingered in the right's thorns, invisible and patient, a specter amid the chamber's glow. "For you," he whispered, steeling himself as Vesperian summoned the vines, their tips sharpening into barbs that gleamed with captured moonlight. The eastern vanguard breached the outer doors with a resonant boom, their leader, a gaunt Dhampir with eyes like fractured ice, advancing under a banner of thorned crimson, flanked by warriors whose armor bore scars of past rebellions. "The marked mortal defiles the bloodline," he snarled, voice echoing like cracking stone, blades raised in a semicircle that halted at the sanctum's rune-barred threshold. Guards clashed briefly, steel singing in the air, but Vesperian's raised hand quelled the fray, the blue flames dimming in deference. Lyrian and Elias approached the altar, hands clasped over its surface as the thorns coiled upward, pricking their palms in unison. Crimson welled, mingling in a silver-threaded pool that swirled with visions, flashes of their meeting in Eldridge's ruins, the fever's fire yielding to mercy's warmth, the assassination's blade turned by love's resolve. The essence radiated outward, a luminous mist that seeped through the wards, enveloping the vanguard in ethereal light. The leader recoiled, his fervor cracking as the right unveiled truths, not provocation, but a bridge against the veil's decay, where suffering's beauty forged unity over division. Gasps rippled through the ranks, blades lowering as philosophical clarity dawned. The immortals shared origins, choices against death that demanded compassion, not conquest. Vesperian stepped forward, his presence a balm amid the tension. "See the thorn's judgment," he intoned. "Redemption blooms where war withers. Stand down, and let this bond mend our fractures." The leader knelt, the banner drooping like a wilted rose, whispers of alliance stirring among the clans. Relief washed over Lyrian, her wound scar fading to invisibility. But Elias felt the rite's deeper imprint. A subtle shift in his veins, the mark evolving into a crown of silver petals, promising eternity's edge without full surrender. Love had redeemed, transforming curse into quiet grace, yet the kingdom's shadows whispered of trials yet to come. As the vanguard retreated into the mist, horns sounding truce, Lyrian turned to Elias, her lips brushing his in a kiss tasting of blood and starlight. "We've chosen," she breathed, the chamber's flames steadying to a golden glow. But from the spire's heights, a lone raven circled, its cry a harbinger. Betrayals lingered in the east, the rites light a beacon for subtler wars. In that suspended peace, Elias realized their redemption was no end, but a beginning laced with thorns, love's eternal vigil against the dark. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts.